Alarming evidence now emerging in the case of two men accused of what could have been a deadly plot, a hate-filled plan that was set to unfold in Virginia. Authorities say the men belong to an extremist group that espouses racial hatred and anti-Semitism. And tonight you're about to hear the FBI recordings right here. The two men are heard planning a deadly attack in the U.S. Here's our Chief Justice Correspondent, Pierre Thomas.
The FBI says these men, fueled by racist hate, plotted mass murder.
The time for violent revolution is now.
Patrick Jordan Matthews and Brian Martin Lemley Jr. are admitted members of the white supremacist group, The Base. Here is Matthews wearing a gas mask, calling for a race war.
If you want the white race to survive, you're going to have to do your part. If you want the white race to survive, you're going to have to do your part.
And what did Dr. Welsing tell us? That it was the fear of genetic annihilation that drove their racist agendas.
Well, the CRESS theory was an attempt back in the late 1960s to explain what I thought is it is a CRESS theory of color confrontation and racism, white supremacy. An attempt to, as a psychiatrist, as a Black psychiatrist, to understand, well, what exactly is this thing that we call racism, white supremacy? Looking at why do white people behave in the way that they do. You see, in concluding that it has to do, number one, with their minority status on the planet, their genetic recessive status, in that they could experience genetic annihilation, in that the overwhelming majority of people on the planet are black, brown, red, and yellow, and whites constitute fewer than 1/10 of the people on the planet.
White people consist of 1/10 of the planet. So genetic annihilation is imminent. The only way you avoid genetic annihilation is to kill off everybody else. But your genetic annihilation would be natural. You're exterminating everyone wouldn't. Yeah, they did this episode, they did this story real quick, and I haven't heard about it since.
One of the things that we find that is happening now is there's this constant countdown you see on the news all the time. So when America's a majority minority nation, so there's still this countdown happening in terms of when white folks will be in the minority.
They will be a majority minority, which is nonsensical.
And they are intentionally promoting that deadline, saying when white people will be genetically a minority in America. That is intentionally to strike up division and fear and hatred. And that's why you see the rise in these hate groups as we get closer to that deadline.
They will be a majority minority, which is nonsensical. There will be a white minority if the non-white, if the black, brown, red, and yellow people are here. They will be the majority and whites will be the minority. You see, and it's a illogical statement to talk about a majority minority. I mean, which is like white supremacy. I still have to put myself on top. I have to pose that I am genetically superior to compensate. I say it's a compensation for a genetic recessive status. Well, I think I was the first person to talk about white genetic annihilation in those terms, and that racism is ultimately a total system for white genetic survival and to prevent white genetic annihilation on a planet that has the genetics and the demographics that exist on third planet from the sun, which is planet Earth. So I was the first to put it in those terms, and my thesis has not been refuted. I would say that if my definition is understood, that racism, white supremacy is the fear on the part of people who classify themselves as white about white genetic annihilation and the concern for white genetic survival. This would therefore mean logically and specifically that the focus has to be on Black males because Black people have the greatest genetic potential to produce the Black pigment melanin, which gives all skin color. And since we have the greatest, the highest level of genetically determined ability to produce this pigment that can cause white genetic annihilation, and it's only males who can impose sexual intercourse. And so the focus consciously, subconsciously has to zero in on the males. This is why I say that understanding, I'm not talking about institutional racism, I'm talking about a total system construct that develops out of certain patterns of thinking on the part of people who classify themselves as white relative to specific realities that exist on this planet. And so then once that is understood, that the fear of genetic annihilation, that takes to the focus on the male, the Black male person, as being the number one perceived threat, the number one enemy, and everything flows from that. Once that is understood, that the fear of genetic annihilation, that takes to the focus on the male, the Black male person, as being the number one perceived threat, the number one enemy, and everything flows from that.
The Black male is the number one perceived threat, which is why you see most of the counterintelligence programs aimed and geared towards him.
ABC News has obtained this newly released video as well as audio evidence from the case. The men had been under investigation for possible domestic extremism, but in December 2019, the FBI obtained a court order allowing them to secretly place a surveillance camera and microphone in the men's Delaware home.
We need to go back to the days estimating blacks and getting rid of them wherever they stand.
We need to go back to the days of effing decimating blacks and getting rid of them wherever they stand. So, any of you black people out here trying to tell me that white supremacy doesn't exist, you are officially an enemy of mine, right along with the white supremacists. You won't be tricking me into putting my guard down just because you dated a white girl before. Shout out to all the non-racist white folk, though.
Men's Delaware home.
We need to go back to the days of estimating blacks and getting rid of them wherever they stand.
The two were arrested in January 2020, just before the FBI claims they intended to launch their civil war by attacking a gun rally in Richmond, Virginia.
While the Virginia situation was happening, big other things happened. Here were some rail lines. Quick, let's shut down the rest of the roads. You know, you can kick off the economic collapse of the U.S. within a week.
Now, my question is this. Did the FBI act due to fears that they had of black people being affected and harmed racially? Or was it the fear of economic collapse in the U.S.? I'll go with the latter.
The FBI believes the men who both had military training had the means to carry out the plot, discovering 1,500 rounds of ammunition, firearms, and tactical gear. Both pleaded guilty to gun charges in June and were each sentenced to 9 years in prison last week. David, the threat of white supremacy is rising. FBI Director Christopher Wray testified this year that the number of domestic terrorism cases involving white supremacists has tripled since he became director in 2017. David, the threat of white supremacy is rising. FBI Director Christopher Wray testified this year that the number of domestic terrorism cases involving white supremacists has tripled since he became director. Wray testified this year that the number of domestic terrorism cases involving white supremacists has tripled since he became director in 2017. David?
All right, Pierre Thomas reporting tonight. Thank you.
Testified this year that the number of domestic terrorism cases involving white supremacists has tripled since he became director in 2017.
Yeah, excuse Nene snoring.